The Middle East's modern history has been turbulent to say the least. As it gained its independence from European imperial forces, the region's states were left with a dearth of political institutions, in some ways destining it for the chaos that ensued. This vacuum would be filled by dynamic ideologies and, above all, charismatic figures who promised to lead their nations to better futures. In this feature-length documentary, I will cover the lives of three of the most prominent Middle Eastern leaders of the 20th century: Mustafa Kemal Ataturk of Turkey, Mohamed Reza Shah Pahlavi of Iran, and Saddam Hussein of Iraq. The three leaders represent the three major cultures of the region: Turkish, Persian, and Arab. Each one of them highlights subtly different political orders, with Ataturk being the poster child for nationalism, whilst the Shah epitomized monarchy and Saddam was the archetypal dictator who drew upon Arab Socialist values. Their legacies continue to dominate their respective nations today, therefore they are integral to comprehend the present situation in all three countries. But more importantly, by tracking their lives, I hope the viewer can get a broader understanding of Middle Eastern history in the 20th century, as the three leaders' combined rules take us from the end of World War I until 2003. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was born in 1881 in present-day Thessaloniki, Greece. Known as Selanik to the Turks, it would remain under Ottoman rule until 1912. The city had a significant Ladino-speaking Jewish population, and this would later fuel his Islamist foes to allege that his ancestors were Jewish converts to Islam, and he himself was in fact a Donmeh, a crypto-Jew. Mustafa's father, Ali Reza Effendi, had served in the military and later became a lumber trader, whilst his mother, Zubayde Hanim, came from a farming background. Mustafa's ethnic origins have been the subject of intense scrutiny, as his parents' backgrounds are difficult to pinpoint. Whilst his mother was most likely of Turkish descent, his father has variously been labelled as Albanian, Slavic, and Turkish. At Mustafa's birth, Ali Reza hung his sword over his cradle, foreshadowing his son's military career. Once of age, his father decided to send him to a secular school, despite his wife's appeals to send him to a madrasa instead. This decision likely contributed to having a profound impact on Mustafa later on, and he would be forever grateful to his father for this. Tragedy would soon hit the household, as Ali Reza passed away when Mustafa was just 7 years old. The young child would continue his secular education in Selanik in the hope of joining the Ottoman bureaucracy, which had undergone somewhat of a Western transformation through the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century. Strong-minded and independent even at an early age, Mustafa decided to follow in his father's footsteps and took an entrance exam to join the local military school. It was while at this school that he got the nickname Kemal, the perfect one, due to the impression he made as a good student in his mathematics classes. In 1895, he moved to a military school in what is now Bitola, North Macedonia, where he made friends with Ali Fethi Okyar, who would later help him in his future political career. After finishing military school, Mustafa enrolled in the War College in Istanbul in 1899. The college was a hotbed of political activism against the ruling Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II. Although not initially involved in political activity, he was eventually introduced to dissident thought which later became known to the authorities, but he was still allowed to finish his course and graduate as a second lieutenant in 1902 and was among the top in his class. When he graduated from the General Staff College in 1905 as a captain, Mustafa had been in military education for over a decade. Not even 25 years old, the young man was now ready to go out into the real world and make a name for himself. Despite being highly accomplished academically, Mustafa's past of political activism would soon catch up with him, as he was informed upon by an Ottoman spy when he discussed the Sultan's political repression. Sent to Damascus with the Fifth Army to keep him away from the capital, he soon grew angry at how the local people were treated by the authorities. In this time, he joined the secret revolutionary group Vatan va Hurriyat, Fatherland and Liberty, with a few of his fellow reformist army officers. A few years later, he was stationed in his hometown of Selanik, where he resumed his political activism by joining the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, which was spearheading the Young Turk movement that opposed Sultan Abdulhamid's government. The next year in 1908, the Young Turks' revolution took place and ushered in an era of constitutional monarchy with a representative government that had initially been enacted in the 1876 Ottoman constitution. Enver Pasha became a leading figure in the movement. He would later emerge as a rival to Mustafa Kemal, whose role in the Young Turks was not so prominent. In 1909, there was further political turmoil when an attempted counter-revolution took place, led by both Islamists who opposed the secularism of the CUP and the Ottoman Liberal Party, which disagreed with the absolutism of the CUP. The uprising was crushed and Abdulhamid II was forced to abdicate as Ottoman Sultan. This further cemented Enver's political credentials, which troubled Mustafa as he felt that the military shouldn't interfere in politics. In 1911, Italy invaded Ottoman Libya, and Mustafa saw a chance to prove himself. Traveling there in disguise with other officers, he distinguished himself on the battlefield despite the Ottomans coming out on the losing end. He even received a wound to his left eye from the debris of a nearby building. When the First Balkan War broke out in October 1912, Mustafa was sent to the Gallipoli Peninsula to defend the Dardanelles Islands. The Ottomans would lose this war as well, losing much of its Balkan territories, including his hometown Selanik to Greece. Mustafa's mother and sister would then join him in Istanbul. The following year saw the outbreak of the Second Balkan War, where the Ottomans regained eastern Thrace from Bulgaria. After the conclusion of hostilities, Mustafa would join his former classmate Ali Fethi Okyar in Sofia after the latter was appointed ambassador to Bulgaria, whilst he himself would be promoted to lieutenant colonel and served as part of the military attaché there. In Sofia, he fell in love with Demetrina Kovacheva, the daughter of the Bulgarian general he had fought during the Balkan Wars. He asked his former foe for permission to marry his daughter twice, but was rejected both times, apparently leaving Mustafa deeply hurt. If Ataturk was alive today, he would have most certainly taken advantage of the AI revolution to expedite his reforms. Like many of you, I use AI systems on a daily basis. That's why I've teamed up with Alina, an industry leader helping to shape the frontier of AI. To do that, they're going to need your help. Alina are offering up to $150 per hour for skilled individuals in a range of subjects such as math, languages, law, science, and many others. Projects are very competitive, so don't be disappointed if you're not selected immediately. But if you are chosen, you'll be training advanced systems through paid projects from the comfort of your home. With no long onboarding, you'll quickly be able to help train models to think, reason, and respond. This is your chance to touch the future. So scan the QR code on screen or check out the link in the description below to shape the technology of tomorrow. In the summer of 1914, the First World War erupted in Europe, and the Ottomans joined the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. Mustafa was given command of the 19th Ottoman Division, which was stationed in the Gallipoli Peninsula. Having prior experience in this region from the First Balkan War, he put this to good use when he defeated the Allied powers' campaign to capture the peninsula in 1915. Victory at Gallipoli made Mustafa a national hero, and he was promoted to colonel. Subsequently, he was sent to the Russian front, where he was given command of the 16th Corps and later the Ottoman Second Army in the Caucasus front. In August 1916, Mustafa mounted a successful counter-offensive against the Russian army where he recaptured Bitlis and Mus from the Russian Empire. The Russian army would later withdraw in March 1917 after Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown in the Russian Revolution. It was whilst fighting the Russians that Mustafa would meet his future right-hand man and successor, Ismet Inonu. His exploits were rewarded when he reached the rank of general and was given the title of Pasha. His military prowess and achievements had made him invaluable for the Ottoman High Command, who re-stationed him in Syria in order to repel the British advance from Egypt. Given command of the 7th Army, Mustafa was shocked by the state of the army defending the province. So he wrote a report to Grand Vizier Talat Pasha regarding the dismal situation, but his observations were ignored, leading him to resign his post. In 1918, he was then tasked with accompanying the Crown Prince Mehmet Vahieddin to Germany, where after surveying the German lines on the Western Front, he concluded that the Central Powers would soon lose the war. On the return trip of the diplomatic visit, he received medical treatment in Austria for recurring physical problems, including ones that related to his kidney, which would go on to afflict him for many years. When the Crown Prince Mehmet ascended the throne in July of that year, he called upon Mustafa Kemal to once again take command of the 7th Army in Palestine. Seeing that the situation was hopeless, he withdrew his men northward towards Anatolia to evade the British from enveloping his forces. The Middle Eastern front in the First World War came to an end in October 1918 with the signing of the Mudros Armistice. In the end, the 3 pashas who led the government throughout the war all fled into exile, leaving Sultan Mehmet VI in charge of a state that was forced to cooperate with the Allied powers. The Allied troops immediately entered Istanbul, where they established a military administration, marking the first time since 1453 that control of the city changed hands. This occupation of their territory and the subsequent Allied plans to partition Anatolia between them helped provide the spark for the Turkish national movement, which was determined to expel the foreign powers. It was in the subsequent Turkish War of Independence that through his leadership of the nationalist resistance movement, Mustafa Kemal would become Ataturk, father of the Turks. Before World War I had even finished, the Allied powers had designs on splitting the Ottoman territory in the Middle East amongst them. In the aftermath of the war, the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France in 1916 was broadly enacted to give control of Syria to the French, whilst the British were allocated Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq. Similar plans were made for Anatolia, the Ottoman heartland. In the east, there was to be an independent Armenia, as well as a potential Kurdish state, and much of the southeastern quarter of it would come under French influence. Whilst in the west, eastern Thrace and territory around Izmir was given to Greece. At the same time, much of western Anatolia fell under the influence of Italy, and Istanbul and the Dardanelles Straits became a demilitarized zone under international control. Across Anatolia, all Ottoman military units were to lay down their weapons and demobilize. It's within this context that Mustafa Kemal arrived in Istanbul towards the end of 1918. Witnessing the city's occupation by the Allies, he was not alone in harboring resentment towards the foreign military presence on Turkish territory. Throughout Anatolia, Ottoman army units refused to demobilize, and local paramilitary groups were being formed to resist the occupation. The local resistance worried the Allies so much that they pressured the Ottoman government to restore order. Mustafa would get his chance to act when he was dispatched at the head of the Third Army by the Sultan to crush these uprisings. In this role, he was given considerable power to restore the defunct authority of the Ottoman state. But the Sultan's authority was a facade. Most Turks were aware that by this point he had been reduced to a puppet by the Allies. Mustafa was well aware of this too, so when he landed with his army at Samsun on the Black Sea coast in May 1919, he immediately set about to initiate his plan of ending the foreign presence on Turkish land. Having resigned from the Ottoman army, he was dismissed by the government and orders for his arrest were issued. Among the military class, he was not alone in supporting the resistance. General Kazim Karabekir had refused the British order to demobilize his 15th Army in eastern Anatolia. Mustafa subsequently linked up with Karabekir in the eastern city of Erzurum, where the Turkish nationalist movement held a congress. There it was decided that due to his competence and commitment to the cause, Mustafa Kemal was to be the leader of the resistance. The Erzurum Congress also produced the Misaki Milli, the National Pact, which set out the aims of the nationalist movement. The pact revolved largely around the issue of sovereignty, affirming that the frontiers of the Turkish nation were inviolable and that its independence was to be upheld against foreign occupation. In keeping with the focus on sovereignty, the National Pact also revoked the Ottoman capitulations. Historically, these were economic concessions that the Sultan had made to certain European powers, but by the 19th century, they had evolved into an instrument of imperialism, and were even stretched to include the exemption of the empire's non-Muslim subjects from Ottoman law. Given the prominence of nationalist ideas, as well as the religious tensions that had been exacerbated when the Ottoman Empire's Balkan territories broke away, considerations of the religious and ethnic makeup of a post-war Turkey were crucial for the Turkish nationalists. Later that year in 1919, the Turkish nationalist movement and the Ottoman government agreed to uphold the National Pact, and the general election was called. Dominated by nationalists associated with the resistance, the newly elected parliament was to be convened early in 1920. But the Allies stepped in. Seeing their position was threatened, they dissolved the parliament and forced the Sultan to convene a government that was hostile to the nationalist movement. It was in this time that İsmet İnönü and Fevzi Çakmak fled Istanbul and joined the nationalist resistance. Mustafa Kemal and his associates now felt compelled to form the Grand National Assembly at Ankara in the Anatolian interior, far from the reach of the Allies. Kemal was elected as its president, and it still remains the legislative body of Turkey to this day. In the summer of 1920, the Allies signed the Treaty of Sevres, officially carving up the Ottoman realm. Kemal and his cohorts immediately declared it invalid and as an affront to Turkish sovereignty. So they set about to overturn the treaty stipulations by force, seeking to expel the Greeks from Anatolia and Thrace, whilst annexing territory from the nascent Armenian state in the east. With the latter aim, they had enthusiastic support from the Bolsheviks of Russia, who were engaged in their own civil war at the time. The Bolsheviks sought to partition the new Armenian state between themselves and Kemal's nationalists, so during the course of the Turkish War of Independence, they sent vital supplies of gold and armaments to Kemal's forces. By December 1920, General Karabekir's forces had recaptured most of the territory in the South Caucasus that had been under Ottoman control prior to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. With the Armenians no longer being a problem, Kemal could now focus on the Western Front with the Greeks. Already throughout 1920, the Turks had fought and defeated the French, who incorporated large numbers of Armenians into their army on the Cilician front in the south. The fighting with the Greeks was the most intense of the war. With British backing, Greece had expanded its Anatolian territories further inland after a summer and autumn offensive in 1920. But with the conclusion of hostilities on the eastern and southern fronts, the Turks could focus all their energy on pushing Greece out of Anatolia. Kemal's forces won a key victory at the First Battle of İnönü in January 1921, after his right-hand man İsmet İnönü had reorganized the irregular militias into a disciplined army. Still, the Greeks made a concerted effort to push their advance further east during their 1921 summer offensive. At the Battle of Kütahya Eskişehir, the Greeks broke through the Turkish lines of resistance and forced them to withdraw beyond the Sakarya River. This was the last line of defense for the Turkish nationalists. Kemal's government in Ankara was now in existential danger. Seeing the dismal situation, the Grand National Assembly replaced İnönü with Mustafa Kemal as commander-in-chief of the Turkish forces. At the pivotal Battle of Sakarya, fighting raged on for 3 weeks in August and September along a battle line that stretched 100 kilometers. In the end, the Greeks were forced to give up on delivering the knockout blow and retreated further west beyond the Sakarya River. For the next year, a stalemate existed between the two sides. By now, divisions within the Allies were emerging. The French and Italians had already negotiated with the Turks, and there were even rumors that they were materially supporting the Turkish national movement. So they called for an armistice, but Kemal was aware that his side now held the strategic advantage. So he prepared for a final assault to expel the Greeks out of Anatolia. Termed as the Great Offensive, the Turkish army launched its biggest operation of the war. During August and September, the Greek army was completely defeated and pushed back to the Aegean Sea. The recapture of Izmir was a jubilant occasion for the Turkish army, but it was marred by the destruction that ensued in the days after its liberation. A fire broke out that blazed for more than a week, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths, mostly Greeks and Armenians. Who was responsible has not been determined, but many have pointed the finger at Turkish soldiers. With the Allies recognizing the changed political landscape and the Turkish nationalists having achieved their major aims, an armistice was signed in October 1922 that brought about the end of hostilities. The issues of control over Eastern Thrace and Istanbul were handled without force, although the British did come close to attacking the Turkish nationalists. Despite their strategic victories, the British still expected Kemal's side to make some concessions in the post-war negotiations. To their alarm, İsmet İnönü, the Grand National Assembly's chosen representative, demanded the fulfillment of the National Pact. During the intense diplomacy at Lausanne, a treaty was finally reached in July 1923. The Republic of Turkey's sovereignty and the Grand National Assembly as its legitimate government were recognized by the international community. Turkish demands for the city of Mosul in Mesopotamia, based on the many Turks that lived there, were to be decided by the League of Nations later on in 1926, when Mustafa Kemal's government would renounce their claims in exchange for a 10% stake in Mosul's oil deposits. The straits around Istanbul were to be returned to Turkish control, but open to international commerce at all times. During the course of the negotiations, Greece and Turkey had realized that the two groups could no longer live together in cooperation, despite Muslims inhabiting Greece for 500 years and Greeks living in Anatolia for thousands of years. Subsequently, a population exchange took place which saw the transfer of almost 500,000 Muslims from Greece in exchange for 1.5 million Anatolian Greeks from Turkey. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. A year before this, the Grand National Assembly had voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate in November 1922. Now, with independence assured, Kemal could work to enact a political vision for the Republic of Turkey that would give it a very different identity to its Ottoman predecessor. No longer consumed by the thought of a war, the Turkish nationalist movement quickly moved to mold the country according to its political vision. Perhaps the best way to understand Ataturk's presidency and his political vision is to go through the 6 arrows, the official ideology of the new republic, and see how each one interplays with the various reforms he introduced. Republicanism. This emphasized the liberty of citizens and the idea of popular sovereignty, which stated that the Turkish people were the source of political power and that the authority of the government and state were rooted in the consent of its people. But in reality, Ataturk's government was hardly representative. The Kemalist Republican People's Party held power in what essentially became a one-party state. In many ways, the Kemalist vision was enforced on the Turkish people without asking for their say-so. This took place despite there being contrarian opinions within the Grand National Assembly. Even in 1924, a breakaway party, the Progressive Republican Party, was formed by some of Ataturk's closest associates, including General Karabekir. The disaffected members agreed in principle with Kemalism, but wanted a slightly more conservative approach to socio-cultural change. In 1930, Ataturk asked his longtime friend Ali Fethi Okyar to form a new party so that a multi-party system could be inaugurated once again. Both occasions resulted in the same thing. Ataturk forced both parties to dissolve because he feared that the opening up of political power would be used by the forces of conservatism, especially the Islamists, to undo or even delay the modernist-inclined reforms intended by the government. Populism. "Ni mutlu Turkum diyen," how happy is the one who says I'm a Turk. Ataturk was particularly fond of this phrase, and it helps to explain his views on populism too. This concept aimed to shift political power to the Turkish citizenry and asserted that national identity came before everything else. In this sense, it was pitted against the Sufi tariqas and Islamic madrasas, with both being institutions that believed in a higher power, therefore placing Islam above the nation. The desire to subsume potential rival strands of thought under the umbrella of the state also saw madrasas come under the supervision of the Ministry of Education. This particular issue was most obviously addressed with the abolition of the Ottoman Khilafah in March 1924. The political functions of the Sultanate had already been abolished in 1922, but the fact that Khalif Abdulmajid II still held the prestige associated with his office was seen by the Kemalists as potentially undermining the authority of the government because it placed another institution above the nation state. As surprising as it may sound today, when Ataturk first came to power, there were some Turks who believed that they'd have a political system that was closer to the one created by the first Khalifs in the 7th century. The following Kemalist principle would show them just how wrong they were. Laïcism. Contrary to some softer forms of secularism, which deal largely with separating religion and governance, Laïcism called for religion to be relegated to the private instead of the public sphere. In this sense, religion was discouraged from not only getting involved in government affairs, its role was to be undermined in society as well. This created the foundation block for much of the social reforms Ataturk would introduce. Of course, this was very different from the centuries-old Ottoman model, which relied heavily on Sharia law to guide its legal matters. Already in the Tanzimat and Second Constitutional Era, Ottoman statesmen had tried to wean themselves off a religiously inspired political model. But Ataturk kicked that process into another gear, closing down Sufi lodges, abolishing the Khilafah, shutting down Sharia courts, and replacing the Ottoman-era position of Shaykhul Islam, the person responsible for religious matters, with the newly established Directorate of Religious Affairs, which came under the direct supervision of the government. The Ottoman legal code, the Mejel, which was based off the Sharia, was abandoned in favor of a blend of different European legal codes that were imported. The day of rest was changed from the traditional Friday to Sunday, yet again mirroring Europe. Wearing the fez was banned in 1925 as part of Ataturk's so-called hat revolution. Because of its attachment to the Ottomans, the fez was viewed as a symbol of backwardness, which is fascinating since the rationale for the fez's introduction in the first place in the 1820s was that it replaced the turban and symbolized the Ottomans' desire to modernize. Sartorial changes were continued in 1934 when a law was passed which banned wearing religious clothing outside places of worship. In 1928, there was an amendment to the constitution which removed Islam as the state religion altogether. It is important to try to understand why Ataturk's outlook on political Islam was so antagonistic. For him and many other reformers, the Ottoman decline could be explained through their lack of desire to keep up with the rapid modernization pursued by European powers. As a result, reliance upon Islam in the political and cultural sphere was interpreted by Ataturk as an obstacle to progress and as a weapon of dogma and ignorance. During the 19th and 20th centuries, reformers in the Islamic world across the ideological spectrum had grappled with this issue, with two main schools of thoughts emerging. There were the Islamists and modernists. Ataturk was clearly from the latter, but it should be noted that the Islamists also expressed dismay at the way in which Islam was being utilized as a socio-political force, with many great thinkers such as Sheikh Muhammad Abdul berating the ignorance which had spread across the Dar al-Islam and allowed European imperialism to triumph. But their solution was to get back to a better and more accurate understanding of Islam, instead of moving away from it and towards the European-styled cultural reforms that the modernists such as Ataturk favoured. Nationalism. The Kemalists' view of nationalism rested heavily on civic nationhood. This puts forth the idea that a nation is defined by its political institutions and liberal values, which are to be upheld by its citizens. Civic nationalism is often contrasted with ethnic nationalism, which defines the nations in terms of ethnicity, in a similar vein to pan-Turkism. Herein lays a contradiction between Kemalist theory and practice, because Ataturk's views clearly drew inspiration from ethnic nationalism too. Turkish culture and history were pedestalized and prioritized above the identities of the other minorities in the country. The Turkish Historical Society was established in 1931 to explore the great heritage left behind by Turkic cultures in the past. The institution was regarded by some as a mouthpiece for Kemalism, which makes sense considering their endorsement of the Turkish history thesis, the idea that Turks had moved from their ancestral homeland in Central Asia and brought civilization wherever they went. This assumption went hand in hand with an even more far-fetched idea known as the Sun language theory, which argued that all human languages were descendants of an original Turkic language. Ataturk's notion of nationality encouraged his citizens to view being Turk as a legal term expressing their citizenship of Turkey, as opposed to an ethnic designation. All the ethnic groups living inside of Turkey were to think of themselves as Turks and Turks only. Whilst on the surface this may seem harmless and even inclusive, in practice this represented an attack on the identities of the Circassians, Greeks, and numerous other minorities. All these groups were forced to go through a process of Turkification, whereby they'd be forcefully assimilated as Turks. One ethnic group has particularly suffered from Ataturk's vision of a nation, and that's the Kurds, the largest ethnic minority in the country. Constituting up to 20% of the population, they make up a majority in many of Turkey's eastern provinces. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, thousands of Kurds in the east were forcefully deported to other areas of Anatolia, whilst Turks were also settled in Kurdish regions, all in an effort to undermine the very infrastructure of Kurdish society. Ataturk was convinced that in order for the nation to be stable and unified, ethnic and cultural distinctions had to be done away with in the search for a unitary political and cultural identity for Turkey. So the Kurds saw their customs and identity come under direct attack. The Kurdish language was banned in the public sphere, deportations were used, and the secular policies of the Kemalist government was internalized by many Kurds as an attack on their traditional Islamic values. Not willing to simply accept the denial of their identity, the 1920s and 30s witnessed three large-scale Kurdish uprisings in the eastern provinces. There was the Sheikh Said Rebellion of 1925, the Ararat Rebellion of 1927 to 1930, and the Dersim Rebellion in 1937. All of them caused major concern for the government in Ankara and were only put down with significant effort and resources from the Turkish army. Reformism. This placed emphasis on the need to replace the traditional institutions and values with modern ones. As a result of Ataturk's obsessive focus on modernity, Turkey was going to be actively modified by reform in order to be the most effective it could be. Naturally, this necessitated a very acrimonious break from the past. In truth, however, this break was not as radical as it seems. From the 1830s onwards, there was lively discourse on a wide range of socio-political reforms in the late Ottoman political scene. The Tanzimat period, an era which lasted from 1839 to 1876, was distinguished by numerous liberal reforms intended to stop the collapse of the empire and help it compete with other European powers. This has forced many observers to question whether Ataturk was really as revolutionary as he first seems. Many of his most famous reforms had precursors in the late Ottoman period, whether it was clothing reforms or linguistic ones. Even the legal system had been weaned off its Sharia dependency. Whilst this is all true, the point still stands that the pace and intensity with which Ataturk pursued his reforms was certainly revolutionary. Within the space of 15 years, Ataturk had changed some of the most basic foundations of Turkish society that had been in place for hundreds of years. A vital difference between Ataturk and the late Ottoman reformers seems to have been this: Tanzimat reformers knew that Western powers were technologically and materially superior to them, and therefore they had to adopt certain Western ideals which suited them. But the Ottoman reformers still largely maintained a sense of confidence in their cultural superiority to the West. Ataturk, however, rejected this. He viewed Western social and cultural standards as being better than the ones that had been in place during the Ottoman Khilafah. This can also explain why he brought changes so quickly, because he felt there had to be a sense of genuine urgency for Turkish society to reform in order to survive in the new international order that was being carved up by Western powers after World War I. As a result, Ataturk viewed it as necessary to portray the Ottomans as backwards for his political vision. Some of the well-known changes he introduced were justified by the Kemalist principle of reformism. Perhaps the most famous of these include his reform of the alphabet. Viewing the traditional Arabic script of Ottoman Turkish as too complex and faced with a population that was largely illiterate, in 1928 Ataturk sponsored the introduction of a new alphabet for the Turkish language that was to use the Latin script. He would follow this up with further language reforms via the Turkish Language Association, which sought to replace Arabic and Persian loanwords with Turkish equivalents. Within society, he disagreed with the traditional segregation of genders that many Islamic societies upheld, instead viewing women's involvement in public affairs as essential. He passed numerous legislations that sought to equalize men and women's role in society in line with European customs, such as granting full political rights to women in 1934. That same year, the surname law was introduced, which required all citizens of Turkey to adopt a fixed hereditary surname. This is when he was given the name Ataturk. Done with the intention to modernize the country bureaucratically, this could also foster a sense of Turkishness within society, as all names related to other ethnicities were prohibited and forced to adopt Turkish renditions of them. Statism. The state was to have an important role in regulating the economy of the country. Turkey's economy at the start of the Republic was very underdeveloped. Almost a decade of constant war had severely damaged its financial infrastructure. The Ottoman Empire's debt to European creditors was still unpaid, so the new government inherited that. Seeing their hopes of gaining the city of Mosul and its oil-rich fields dashed, the Kemalists saw the need for the state's involvement in jump-starting the economy. This problem became especially pronounced in the aftermath of the Great Depression that shook the world. Despite these issues, Turkey's economy, both in the agricultural and industrial sectors, grew massively as a result of Ataturk's 5-year economic plans. Ataturk can be a confusing person to understand. He favoured a representative parliamentary democracy, but enacted a one-party state. He championed rationality and empiricism, but supported wild delusional ideas such as the Sun language theory. he rejected ethnic nationalism but indirectly sponsored it. I've found what helps me to understand Ataturk's views and actions is the term sovereignty. Throughout the course of his life, his homeland had been at the prey of other powers, the decaying of the Ottoman state, then the War of Independence. So as president, he shifted his attention to ensuring that the internal infrastructure of Turkey was sufficiently strong enough to withstand shocks and bring about a degree of stability that could then be used as a platform for progress, which in turn would further strengthen the nation state and continue to insulate its sovereignty from internal and external threats. Upon his death in November 1938, he left in his wake a young but assertive nation that has in some ways become a beacon of progress and strength in the Middle East. Having said that though, Turkey today finds itself having to answer unresolved issues regarding its very identity, specifically its relationship with Islam and how that clashes with its notion of progress and modernity. In the region, Ataturk's modernizing policies had an influence on neighboring Iran, whose leader Reza Shah shared warm relations with the Turkish president. Reza Shah's assertive vision for Iran brought the country out of a prolonged decline that stretched back to the 18th century. But that assertiveness worked to his detriment when World War II broke out and he soon found himself out of power. His son Mohamed Reza Shah was placed on the throne as he was thought to be more malleable to Western interests. Whilst this initially proved to be the case, in time the young Shah would presume his father's forcefulness as he sought to make Iran the paramount Middle Eastern power. Mohamed Reza Shah's reign brought a degree of prosperity and prestige unseen for centuries in Iran. But his pro-Western, heavy-handed style left many in his country deeply resentful, culminating in a revolution that ensured Mohamed Reza Shah would be the last Shah of Iran. Nineteenth century Iran was led by the Qajars, a Persianized Turkic dynasty who stably united Persia under one banner in 1797. They took over a nation that had been sharply declining relative to its more powerful Ottoman and Russian neighbors. The Qajars made some efforts to reverse this backslide, mostly in vain. Most notably, a reluctant attempt at military modernization saw the creation of the Cossack Brigade by Russian officers. This was symbolic of Russian domination of Qajar Iran and would directly play a role in the dynasty's deposition. Iran's holdings in the Middle East and Central Asia were coveted by British and Russian imperial leaders, often leading to territorial disputes, in which the weaker Persian state was forced into unequal treaties. Iranian sovereignty reached its lowest point during the Great Game between Russia and Britain, as Persia forfeited all oil rights to Britain in 1901 and was carved into spheres of influence in the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. However, Iran was too weak to repel any incursions and remained nominally independent only for European convenience. Thus, the Qajar monarchs willingly served as glorified vassals of imperial powers to secure their own regime. This proved incredibly unpopular, particularly among the established clerics, or mujtahidi, the merchant class, the bazari, and young Persian notables with Western educations, usually the sons of Iranian politicians or military officers. It was primarily these middle and upper class factions who sparked the Persian constitutional revolution, ironically both outraged and intellectually armed by European dominance. Control of the Persian state repeatedly switched sides between the Qajar Shahs and constitutionalists during this tumultuous 6-year period. Only in 1911, supported by 12,000 Russian troops, did the monarchy decisively reassert authority. The constitutionalists' disunity sank them. The three factions had exceedingly different ideas of how to square Persia's complicated relations with Western powers, and whether post-Qajar Iran should look more secular or pious. Still, it had become abundantly clear that the Qajar regime was unpopular and relied on European militaries to maintain its slight grasp on power. It was under these circumstances that Reza Khan rose to power. Reza Khan was born in 1878 and grew up in a military household. He joined the Cossack Brigade by age 16 and collected connections and promotions over the coming decades, eventually being named the Brigadier General. The Cossack Brigade, as mentioned earlier, was a Russian stain on Persian prestige, but Reza would use this to his advantage. The modern weaponry and training the unit possessed distinguished it as the most valuable personnel in the Qajar military, and the soldiers' loyalty to individual officers and foreign powers as opposed to the Shah made it possible for Reza to win their loyalty for himself before turning against the monarchy. His cunning paid off in 1921, when he marched into Tehran as the head of the Cossack Brigade and staged a coup. Quickly consolidating power by leveraging his dual position as brigade commander and minister of war, Reza Khan was officially named Shah Reza Pahlavi by an assembly of parliament 4 years later in December 1925. Western influences on Reza Shah were clearly visible over his near 20-year reign of Iran. The nation went into a significantly more secular direction, as seen through his decisions to shut down many Islamic madrasas and Christian missionary schools, and his royal decree prohibiting women from wearing the traditional Islamic chador. Societal views of gender were particularly uprooted. Academic institutions became required to admit female students, and women were expected to be visible in public settings, as opposed to remaining domestic and bashful that was preferred previously. However, Reza Shah was also a thorough and ruthless strongman. He firmly believed that history was made by great men like himself, and grew furious at any obstacle to efficient execution of his ideas. His assertion to foreign powers to refer to his nation as Iran rather than Persia in order to reflect the historical name of the region remains a source of pride for many Iranians today, and was critical in legitimizing Iranian nationalism at the time. But the wording deliberately conflated Persians with other Iranian ethnic groups and was used as justification for sweeping forced assimilations, bolstering Persian culture while neglecting the rest. Modernizing autocrats in this period viewed the homogenization of their state as a key principle of nation building. Reza Shah's reign ended abruptly with the Allied occupation of Iran in 1941, as he was forced to abdicate to his son. Reza Shah, the beloved and feared father of modern Iran, died in exile in Johannesburg in 1944. At that point, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, then only 24 years old and deeply anxious and insecure, was the last living Persian Shah. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was born on the 26th of October 1919 and grew up with material comfort in his pocket and lofty expectations on his shoulders. As the eldest son of Reza Khan and his second wife, Taj al-Muluk, he assumed center stage of the family dynamic from the moment he was born. His mother assured him from the beginning he was preordained for greatness, and his twin sister later referred to him as always the center of her existence. His dynamic with his father was also supportive, though far more complicated. Mohammad Reza wrote during his reign that his father was one of the most frightening men he had ever known, citing his unyielding resolve and his ability to instantly command respect from anyone. Reza Shah also often showered praise upon his son and expressed confidence in Mohammad Reza's ability as the future Iranian sovereign. Indeed, Mohammad Reza was perhaps the only person who could speak as frankly and intimately to Reza Shah without consequence. But as the heir presumptive to the Persian throne, paternal sentimentality could not come at the expense of rigid learning and discipline for Mohammad Reza. Upon officially being named Crown Prince aged 6, he was stripped from his domestic life with his mother and sisters and sent to military academies his father established for the specific purpose of educating him. And though they spoke with more candor privately, the two men usually referred to each other by the formal Shoma as opposed to the less formal Tu. Mohammad Reza's own personal assessment of his father frequently oscillated during his lifetime. At age 11, Mohamed Reza was sent by his father to Le Rosey Institute in Switzerland. Nervous and excited to finally go west for the first time, especially without parental supervision, Mohamed Reza struggled balancing himself at Le Rosey. Differing accounts even exist as to whether Mohamed Reza independently and awkwardly forced himself into fistfights to garner attention, or if he had to be convinced altogether to stick up for himself, but we do know his shyness was apparent. Perhaps this shyness endeared him to Ernest Perron, son of the school's gardener, over 10 years Mohamed Reza's senior and the Crown Prince's best friend. Perron, often bullied for being gay, sparked Mohamed Reza's interest in French poetry and literature, the future Shah falling deeper in love with Western culture in the process. They were so close in fact that Mohamed Reza brought him on his return to Iran in 1936, much to the chagrin of Reza Shah. Mohamed Reza inherited his father's admiration of the West, but not his temper or decisiveness. The chronically tense relations between Reza Shah's Iran and Europe reached a breaking point during World War II, as Reza Shah's adamant stance of neutrality coupled with Iran's strategic value in the Caucasus and Middle East triggered an occupation of Pahlavi land by the United Kingdom and Soviet Union, an existential threat for Iran. So well known was the Crown Prince's passiveness relative to his father that Iranian generals met privately with Mohamed Reza to ask his permission to surrender to the encroaching Soviet army. Prior to his abdication, when Reza Shah found out one of his generals had gone behind his back, he beat and nearly executed the general on the spot upon learning of this, only agreeing to instead court-martial the man at the pleas of Mohamed Reza. Regardless, Iran was now controlled by the Allies, who had long considered Reza Shah a burdensome nuisance. Thus, Mohamed Reza Pahlavi Shah was coronated on the 17th of September 1941. But a title alone is not enough to earn respect, and Mohamed Reza Shah repeatedly proved that he was still the same insecure little boy he was at Le Rosey Institute. He was disrespected by other world leaders. Particularly humiliating was the Tehran Conference in 1943, where Joseph Stalin insisted only the Red Army serve as bodyguards within the Shah's own home. Internal dissidents also made multiple attempts on his life within the first decade of his regime. Likewise, Mohamed Reza did not respect the reverence his title carried, preferring to invest his time into his 25 custom-built cars or writing French poetry with Perron. He could not shift this blame onto the constitution either, though the 1906 constitution did call for a parliament in addition to the Shah. It also allowed the Shah to rule directly if he wanted to, thereby rendering any checks on his power as null. Even after his jealous dismissal of his rival, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1952, Mossadegh's popular support forced the Shah to begrudgingly reinstate him. By 1953 though, Mossadegh's parliament had repeatedly aggravated Western interests, particularly after the nationalization of Iran's oil in 1951, blocked out British access to Persian oil. Thus the decision was made by the American and British governments to replace him. On the 16th of August 1953, at the explicit request of American and British ambassadors, Mohamed Reza Shah armed and ordered army officers to execute the coup of Mossadegh's government, an attempt that failed spectacularly and forced the Shah to flee first to Baghdad and then to Rome. In the coming days, however, a series of missteps by Mossadegh and aggressive plays by CIA operatives placed control of Iran firmly in the hands of the new Prime Minister Fazlollah Zahidi and of course Mohamed Reza Shah. When Mohamed Reza was told of his triumph at home from his Roman hotel room, he emotionally cried, "I knew they loved me," and returned to Tehran on the 22nd of August, 3 days after he successfully defended his regime. Cognizant now of the awesome and fragile power he held, Mohamed Reza Shah Pahlavi started laying the groundwork for his future reforms upon his return. Reforms that would drastically change Iranian identity and prove to be disastrous for his dynasty. perhaps grappling with his reputation as a coward among foreign actors, or maybe reminded of the series of events that brought his father first into power and then into exile, Mohammad Reza asserted his power with an unseen confidence after the 1953 coup. Taking advantage of public perception of him as weak, he played the traditional Iranian elites off each other to divide dissent, and drastically increased his domestic support by largely adopting Mossadegh's popular left-wing policies and rhetoric, as well as granting clemency to many of Mossadegh's supporters convicted after the coup. His moves also paid off on an international stage. Mohammad Reza's improved position gave him leverage to shift the balance of power in Iran's relations with Western nations. For example, he prohibited American officials from meeting with his political opponents following an American-assisted failed coup attempt. As the Shah sharpened his diplomatic abilities, with them increased Iranian prestige. However, so too did Mohammad Reza's abuses of power. During this period, Mohammad Reza took further discriminatory measures against the persecuted Bahia religious minority in Iran, and often ordered military forces to simply fire upon mass protests, a technique he would come to rely heavily on. Mohammad Reza's persona also shifted strangely during the 1950s, perhaps reflecting issues from his childhood. He began to promote a messianic-like cult of personality around himself and Cyrus the Great, eerily echoing dreams his mother shared with him that envisioned him as an almost prophetic figure. His lifelong habits in womanizing and acts of infidelity may also have their origins in his childhood, as his mother and sisters categorically doted upon him, often at their own expense. This must have made 1958 a particularly hard year for the Shah, as he and his second wife Soraya, his true love to his dying breath, ended their marriage due to Soraya's infertility. But Mohammad Reza soon faced an even harder challenge, with a person who would perhaps ultimately become more significant to his life than anyone before or after. In 1962, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini sent a letter to the Shah airing his grievance on a new law that allowed non-Muslim local elected officials to take the oath of office on holy books other than the Quran, and asking for it to be struck down. Mohammad Reza wrote back to Khomeini denying his request and tauntingly referring to him as Hujjat al-Islam, a rank below Ayatollah. Further pressure from the ulama forced the Shah to reluctantly nullify the law, at least for the moment. But this was only the first public row between the Ayatollah and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah, a feud that only ended with the deposition of the latter 16 years later. On January 9, 1963, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi announced his intention to gradually implement a series of sweeping reforms that he termed the White Revolution, intended to fundamentally change Iranian societal structure. Most immediately pressing was land reform, followed by the nationalization of Iranian forests and pasture land, as well as the privatization of government-owned manufacturing and the mandatory profit sharing for industrial laborers employed by businesses in the private sector. Women's suffrage and the foundation of the literacy cause within the Iranian army made up the last 2 points of emphasis of the initial 6 announced White Revolution reforms. The reforms were not universally popular, with the penultimate one particularly sparking unrest amongst the established Shia ulama, as Khomeini escalated his war of words with Mohammad Reza, directly referring to the Shah as a wretched, miserable man, with Khomeini even vaguely threatening him that his current path would only lead to him someday being deposed by the popular will of the people. These words led to Khomeini's arrest 2 days later and his exile not long after, as well as an even bigger spike in unrest. As in 1962, Mohammad Reza underestimated the extent of Khomeini's popularity in his insensitive handling of these encounters. He never fully grasped this lesson. To many, however, Mohammad Reza's reforms were a welcome change in fortune. From an economic standpoint, the White Revolution was lucratively successful for both the Iranian government and the average Iranian, as the nation for a time saw an annual growth rate of 9.8%. Literacy rates soared as levels of per capita income and the condition of the middle class became unprecedentedly robust. Iranian women also enjoyed a higher legal status than at any other time in the nation's history before or since, outraging much of the established ulama. Land reforms were the most critical aspect of Mohammad Reza's White Revolution, and they failed to deliver as hoped. Though roughly 1.1 million Iranian families acquired property for the first time through the reforms, none received more than 10 hectares, the minimum required to survive in most regions. Furthermore, 700,000 Iranian families remained landless even after reforms. And though the intended effect of weakening existing nobles and landlords was met, the biggest winners were 640,000 rural sharecropping families, who already had property rights, but could also now gain up to a cool 200 hectares through the reforms. Urban centers like Tehran won too, as many of the rural poor thought it was better to sell their stocks and try their luck as urban wage earners. On the whole, a majority of Iranians did see some benefit from the land reforms, but they were marginal gains for most, which sowed discontent as the gap between the rich and poor widened. Let's not forget, Mohammad Reza's reforms directly contributed to the Pahlavi family's gains as commercial landowners. As a result of his obvious pro-Western and pro-capital biases, it became abundantly clear that Mohammad Reza Shah was painfully out of touch with the Iranian people who he was supposed to lead and protect. The Shah responded to any such criticisms with arbitrary persecution, going so far as to label any Iranian who was not a believer in monarchy as a traitor, all the while bolstering his own cult of personality in increasingly delusional and megalomaniac ways. Mohammad Reza surrounded himself with yes-men at court who regularly praised him as the equal of great historical leaders he admired. Famously, he celebrated 2,500 years of Persian monarchy in October of 1971 at Persepolis, which included a parade of soldiers in the garb of warriors from each Persian dynasty, a bizarre decision not just for its self-grandeur, excess, or lack of necessity in a time of political unrest, but also because it emphasized the pre-Islamic history of Iran, further enraging the ulama. On the 1st of May 1974, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi first met with French doctor Georges Flandrin, who that same day diagnosed him with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. The cancer would kill him in less than 6 years' time, having outlived his regime. By 1978, it was clear to the public that Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was unwell, and that his regime itself was in danger of dying altogether. Though his cancer had not yet been made public knowledge, he had been uncharacteristically absent from the public eye since spring. He cancelled his long-planned trip to Bulgaria and Hungary in May, a fact made even more worrying because of the Iranian political climate at the time. There had been continuous protests in the streets of Iran since October 1977, coinciding with the death of Mustafa Khomeini, son of the exiled Ayatollah, under suspicious circumstances related to the Pahlavi Savak. In January the following year, having battled terminal cancer for 4 years now, without proper treatment for lengthy periods of that time, and at this point perhaps on medication that impaired his cognitive ability, Mohammad Reza was incensed by tapes of a Khomeini sermon in which the Ayatollah accused him of being corrupt. He insisted on publishing a libelous article in response accusing Khomeini of being a secret operative for the British and an Indian posing as an Iranian. Though people close to the Shah considered the decision unwise, the article was still published on the 7th of January and led to an acute intensification of anti-Shah protests the following day. Mohammad Reza had taken the bait, reminiscent of the earliest years of his regime. He was being outsmarted and outplayed. The Shah's ability to play disparate factions against each other to impose his own will on a situation was now backfiring spectacularly. As Khomeini gathered support from all divides within the Persian political spectrum, in the hopes of returning from exile and supplanting the Shah, Mohammad Reza was regressing at realpolitik. September of 1978 would serve as a coup de grace of Pahlavi's rapidly deteriorating physical and cognitive health, as well as his dynasty at large. On the 8th of September, a military detachment sent by Mohammad Reza fired upon protesters in Jaleh Square in Tehran, killing at least 64 civilians. Though it was not remotely the first time the Shah employed callous violence to quell dissent, the Black Friday massacre was notable both for its brutally high casualty count and indicative of Mohammad Reza's complete lack of desire to make good faith negotiations with the protesters. Many contemporary commentators agree that the Shah's deposition became an inevitability after Black Friday, but whether out of stubbornness or outright delusion, the Shah refused to yield and took shockingly desperate measures to maintain power. On the 2nd of October, he granted clemency to Iranian dissidents living abroad, including Khomeini, perhaps hoping the decision would echo his pardons of many of Mossadegh's supporters 25 years earlier. But by this point, the Shah did not have the leverage for this move to hold any significance and would lose any remaining leverage when a strike by oil labourers toppled the oil industry later that month, as well as the confirmation in late December that the military's loyalty was now divided, with many leading generals preferring Khomeini to Pahlavi. Finally, realizing he was out of options, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi fled Iran on the 16th of January 1979, giving the unmoved Prime Minister Shahpur Bakhtiar, himself a former associate of Mossadegh and a political prisoner under the Shah, the keys to his crumbled state. Bakhtiar allowed Khomeini to return to Iran in the hopes of negotiating preferable terms in a regime change. But Khomeini categorically rejected any compromise, replacing Bakhtiar as prime minister and formally dissolving the monarchy. The last remnants of Pahlavi rule in Iran, as well as 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, were stamped out quickly and giddily on the 11th of February 1979. Moribund and decaying, Mohammad Reza sought haven in several countries, but he did not stay anywhere for very long at the behest of his hosts. Though now only seeking end-of-life care and cancer treatment, the former Shah served to be a public relations cancer for any government who agreed to house him. He twice received asylum in Egypt and spent his final 4 months there. Then, on July 27, 1980, it was all over. Thousands of miles removed from Tehran, nearly 40 years removed from the anxious boy in a military uniform succeeding his father, and despised by both his own people and the Western powers he so envied, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi died in exile in Cairo. Less than 2 months after the Shah's death, Iran had to deal with the even more pressing issue of an Iraqi invasion of their soil. Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, had sought to take advantage of the turmoil in Iran to prevent the spread of revolutionary Shi'ism to his predominantly Shia nation. The conflict would descend into a deadly stalemate, bringing both countries to the brink of financial ruin. Not to mention, it led to a turning point in the career of Saddam, who up until the conflict had overseen the rapid development of Iraq's domestic infrastructure and military. After the Shah, Saddam would become the preeminent Middle Eastern leader, dominating news headlines for the next 25 years. According to official records, Saddam was born in 1937 amidst incredibly challenging conditions. His home outside the city of Tikrit was a mud hut with no running water, no electricity, and scarce food. Saddam's name means one who confronts, and from the very beginning, the little boy learned to confront harsh challenges. Chief among those challenges was the fact that Saddam's father had died before he was born. his early years were shaped by his cruel and exacting stepfather. Hassan the Liar, what he was locally known as, would often beat his stepson with an asphalt-covered stick. To escape the incessant abuse at home, Saddam sought the friendship of neighboring children. But being fatherless carried a heavy stigma, and the other kids teased and ridiculed him relentlessly. To defend himself from bullies, little Saddam started carrying an iron bar whenever he left the family hut. Like stepfather, like son. In this harsh environment, a sense of self-reliance and suspicion began to form the contours of Saddam's personality. Cruelty germinated within the boy. The world was cruel, why should he be any different? Saddam would be rescued from his life of poverty when he was 10 years old and sent to live with his uncle Khairullah Talfa in Tikrit. He was a school teacher and former army officer who had just been released from prison for his participation in the 1941 anti-British nationalist revolt of Rashid al-Gaylani. Under his tutelage, Saddam learned to read, write, and spell his own name. He also learned about Iraq's complicated and contentious place on the world stage. World War I had brought an end to 400 years of Ottoman domination of the Middle East. The victorious allies, France and Great Britain, were quick to dismantle the empire and carve up the Middle Eastern territories for themselves. The borders of modern-day Iraq were created by Europeans to serve the interests of Europeans, with little thought given to the entrenched rivalries and bitter tensions between the tribes and ethnic groups in the region. Iraq had gained its independence from Britain in 1932, as a result of a very strong nationalist movement inside of the country. But this independence was nominal at best, since the British still controlled the country's foreign affairs and oil supply. This fostered huge resentment amongst most sectors of Iraqi society at the British lack of respect for Iraq's sovereignty. Iraqi nationalists were given an opportunity to free themselves from the shackles of imperialism with the start of World War II. Led by Rashid Ali Gaylani, the nationalists sought to counterbalance the British by aligning themselves with Germany, subsequently seizing power in a coup on April 1, 1941. But Iraq and its resources were too important to the Allied war effort to let this happen. So a month later, the British invaded the country and occupied it once again. In 1948, the Iraqi government tried to sign a revision of the 1930 Anglo-Iraqi Treaty, which would have seen British influence inside the country continue. But the Iraqi people rose up and showed their displeasure in the subsequent Al-Wathba uprising. In 1952, the Iraqi Intifada took place, with widespread strikes and protests calling for an end to the British presence in the country, and some even calling for King Faisal to resign. Prominent thinkers such as Sati al-Husri had used his position as Director of General Education in the 1920s to allow pan-Arab beliefs to seep into the very fabric of the education system. From the 1940s onwards, there emerged a trend amongst educated military officers politicized by nationalism who subsequently tried to vie for power. This trend was only encouraged by the success of the Egyptian Free Officers Group that spearheaded the 1952 revolution. When its leader, Jamal Abdel Nasser, followed that up with a victory in the Suez Crisis of 1956, the Arab world's imagination was set on fire. In Nasser, the Iraqi nationalists saw a symbol that they could emulate, leading politically conscious military officers to organize and model themselves after Nasser's free officer movement. It was within this tumultuous environment that a teenage Saddam Hussein experienced his political awakening. In 1955, Saddam moved with his uncle to the capital, Baghdad. Under the influence of his uncle Khairullah, Saddam became a supporter of the Ba'ath Party. Small in size but potent in purpose, the Ba'ath Party was a secular organization whose main goals included the unification of Arab nations under one banner and the elimination of imperialist influence over the Middle East. Like most Iraqis, Saddam came to resent the British colonial intrusion of their nation, their monopolization of Iraq's oil resources, and the local lackeys that peddled their propaganda. He sought to make himself useful to the Ba'athist cause, but the poorly educated country boy wasn't much of an intellectual, so he served as street muscle for the local party cells by participating in anti-government demonstrations and forming a gang that prowled the suburbs and intimidated shop owners. The Hashemite monarchy, for its part, had tried to undermine the popularity of these populist ideologies by promising land reforms and greater rights to its citizens. The government's position had been strengthened by the fact that it was receiving more and more money thanks to its oil revenue. But for many in the country, these reforms were not enough, and it was hard to argue with them. Almost all of the wealth generated from oil went directly to the British or a small group of Iraqi elites. Iraq's increasing prosperity could not stop the spirit of rebellion, and everything would change on July 14, 1958. At the beginning of the year, the Hashemite monarchies of Jordan and Iraq formed the Arab Federation, a confederation that was supposed to rival Egypt and Syria's merger into the United Arab Republic that same year. Later that summer, Jordan's King Hussein requested his cousin Faisal of Iraq to send military units to Jordan for fear of a Syrian attack. The Iraqi free officers saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike. The secret group's leader, Abdul Karim Qasim, a high-ranking army officer, decided against marching to the Jordanian border and instead turned on Baghdad, seizing the capital. The coup was effective, but it did set a bloody precedent for the future of political transitions in the country. Since much of the royal family was executed, including King Faisal and his uncle, the former regent Abdullah, Prime Minister Nouri al-Said tried to escape dressed as a woman in an abaya, but was caught and shot. Prince Abdullah and Prime Minister Said's bodies were then mutilated and dragged through the streets of Baghdad by the angry mob. The new revolutionary government under Prime Minister Qasim had come to power with a message that cut across political factions. Whilst this helped in terms of giving it greater popularity, it also provided it with a lack of direction and ideological structure. Two main strands of thought emerged in this confused atmosphere. One, supported by Qasim and the Iraqi Communist Party, focused on a Wataniya or Iraq First policy, whilst another, espoused by pro-Nasirists and the Ba'athist Party, wanted Qawmiya or Pan-Arab policies. The latter sought to unite with Nasser's United Arab Republic, whilst Qasim and his supporters wanted to put Iraq first and foremost. General Qasim, keen to preserve his newly acquired power, shunned the pan-Arabic aspirations of the Ba'athists. This enraged the Ba'athists, who felt they had been betrayed. No sooner had General Qasim taken the reins of power than he too was marked for death. To carry out the deed, the Ba'athists needed a triggerman. A hit squad was formed around Saddam, and meticulous plans were made to carry out the assassination on October 7, 1959 in the capital. But when the big day came, Saddam and his conspirators forgot the carefully choreographed plan and began spraying shots wildly into the street. A short gunfight ensued in which one of the assassins was killed, Qasim took a bullet in the shoulder and arm, and young Saddam was shot in the leg. He escaped to Cairo, Egypt, waiting for the day he could return. That day came 3 years later in February 1963. A Ba'athist-aligned coup, likely with CIA involvement, took control of the Iraqi government by overthrowing and executing General Qasim. Upon his return to Iraq, Saddam married his first cousin, Sajida Talfa, the daughter of Uncle Khairallah. As Saddam's family was growing, so too did his political ambitions. His uncle's old friend, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, had become the prime minister of the country and actively pursued a policy of nepotism by appointing fellow Tikritis to important positions, so he took Saddam under his wing as a bodyguard and confidant. But later that year, there was another coup as President Abdul Salam Arif purged the Ba'athist Party from the government, on account of their infighting. Less than a year later, Saddam found himself behind bars, credibly accused of a plot against the government. He spent 2 years imprisoned before staging a daring escape in 1966. The Baathists were already plotting their return to power, and in the summer of 1968, they struck. The so-called July Revolution was the fourth coup of its kind in less than a decade. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam Hussein's mentor and benefactor, was named president of the new regime, and he brought his energetic protege along for the ride. By the age of 31, Saddam was essentially the second most powerful person in Iraq. As the Deputy Secretary of the Revolutionary Command Council, he appointed political commissars within the officers' corps that bypassed the chain of command and reported directly to him. With the military firmly in his grip, Saddam set his sights on the Iraqi population itself, as he transformed the country into a totalitarian police state. Iraqi prisons were soon overflowing with screaming detainees. But back at home, Saddam's house was filled with the sound of giggling children. By 1972, Saddam and Sajida had 5 kids, 2 sons and 3 daughters. As a result, many Iraqi citizens looked at Saddam and saw a committed family man. In reality, Saddam spent very little time at home, preferring the company of sycophants and informants as he held court in opulent Baghdadi nightclubs. He developed a taste for tailored suits, expensive cars, and rich food. But as Saddam's waistline expanded, so too did his visions for the country. These visions would be funded by oil money. Iraq has some of the most abundant oil and natural gas fields on the planet. But from its discovery in 1927, the revenue from it flowed out of the country, as the British-run IPC, the Iraq Petroleum Company, had secured exclusive rights to drill for the black gold liquid. Previous Iraqi governments had tried and failed to reclaim its financial sovereignty, but it was Saddam Hussein who succeeded when he concluded a deal to nationalize the IPC in 1972. That sudden windfall allowed the government to spend huge amounts of money on social programs, construction projects, welfare, and education. For the first time in a long time, life was getting better for people in Iraq. And with great wealth came the need to protect it. He signed a dizzying series of armed deals with foreign countries throughout the 1970s. In the span of just a few years, Iraq's military became a formidable, fully modern force. Saddam's nationalization of the oil industry, modernization of the military, and expansion of social infrastructure turned him into a superstar. As his television appearances became ubiquitous, the foundations of his cult of personality were starting to form. It was an open secret that Saddam Hussein was substantially more popular than President al-Bakr himself. By the late 1970s, Saddam believed his old mentor had been a useful figurehead, but now that he had attained full control over the military, the party, and the state security, Saddam no longer had a need for the aging patriarch. So, on the evening of July 16, 1979, Saddam Hussein visited President al-Bakr at the presidential palace. There he gave al-Bakr an ultimatum: step aside or else. Saddam was now the new Iraqi president at just 42 years of age. To ensure the longevity of his new regime, he would need to purge the Ba'ath Party of anybody who stood in his way. So on July 2, 1979, less than a week after al-Bakr's resignation, Saddam called a meeting of all the senior Ba'ath Party leadership. There, he told them that he had uncovered a plot against the government by party members who were inside the building. One of the alleged leaders of the conspiracy, the ex-president's secretary who happened to be tortured beforehand, then read out 68 names of party members that were apparently involved in the plot. Over the next few weeks, these men were tried and sentences were given out, with many set to be executed. But no sooner had he achieved absolute power and prosperity than it began to slowly turn to ash in his palms. In the 1970s, Iran was a modernizing nation on the rise. Its huge oil reserves brought an influx of cash which was then used to rapidly develop the country. Its longtime ruler, Mohamed Reza Shah, wanted Iran to recapture its past glory after seeing it be at the prey of European imperial powers for over a century. So he quickly sought to modernize the country's military. Spending billions of dollars, the Shah bought advanced weaponry and equipment from countries like the USA and UK. With its vast array of tanks, state-of-the-art fighter jets, and impressive warships, Iran was well on its way to becoming one of the world's most powerful military forces. Regionally, it became the preeminent power in the Middle East, thanks to its GDP and military. But beneath this picturesque surface, the country faced serious fundamental issues. Despite the massive windfall from oil, Iran's newfound wealth was only available to a select class as a result of the rampant nepotism that plagued the government. Those who were favored by the regime received lucrative contracts and positions facilitated by the oil boom. At the same time, the traditional forces within society were alienated by the Shah's ardent support for Iran's westernization. In 1978, tensions boiled over as huge protests led by the ulama started gathering momentum. From his exile, Ayatollah Khomeini soon emerged as the leader of the anti-regime movement. In a remarkable sequence of events, the Shah stepped down at the beginning of 1979, being replaced by Khomeini. The new supreme leader of Iran announced that the country was to be a theocracy, ruled by the ulama itself. As his emerging neighbor Iran was plunged into revolutionary frenzy, Saddam would watch with keen interest. He, like much of the ruling elite, was Sunni Muslim. Despite being excluded from the halls of power, Shia Muslims actually held a demographic majority. Therefore, the ascension of the Ayatollahs to power in Iran particularly worried Saddam about the prospect of his own Shia Iraqis rising up against him, especially since Khomeini championed the exportation of his revolutionary ideals abroad. The roots of the danger lay in Iraq's demographics. Despite being ruled by an entrenched Sunni minority, Iraq's population was predominantly Shia. For years, the Shia had been excluded from the halls of power, and they harbored bitter resentments about the discrimination they endured under the Sunni tribal elite. The Iraqi leader took this threat to his survival very seriously. In addition, the two countries had a long-standing feud over the Shatt al-Arab waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. In 1975, Saddam had personally been involved in the Algiers Agreement, which saw Iraq concede its right to the waterway to the Shah. But he had signed this largely to put an end to the Kurdish rebellion within Iraq, which was sustained by Iranian support for the Kurds. Iran's new government may have been crackling with revolutionary zeal, but militarily they were weak. Saddam saw his opportunity to strangle the Ayatollah's threatening vision in its crib. As a result, on September 22, 1980, squadrons of Iraqi fighters swarmed into Iranian airspace and attacked a collection of bases near Tehran. The Iran-Iraq War had begun. Saddam had envisioned his air attack would have the same effect as the Israeli strikes did in the Six-Day War of 1967. Upon securing aerial superiority, he believed Iraqi victory would be swift and inevitable. Unfortunately for him, this did not materialize. The aerial attack was unsuccessful, only doing partial damage to the air bases and destroying an insignificant number of aircraft. Nevertheless, Saddam launched a ground invasion the very next day, attacking in 3 separate locations in the north, center, and south. Much of the Iraqi manpower was dedicated to the southern attack, which targeted Iran's Arab-dominated Khuzestan province, in the process fully securing the Shatt al-Arab. Almost immediately, the Khuzestani cities of Khorramshahr and Abadan were besieged. Both sieges would be protracted and delayed the Iraqi offensive, thus giving Iran sufficient time to stabilize and calculate its strategy. Although Khorramshahr would be captured by the end of October, The Iraqi offensive was seriously delayed by outnumbered Iranian units who fought tooth and nail to defend the city. Abadan, the site of the famous refinery, took even longer, with the siege being dragged out until September 1981 and ending in an Iranian victory. Right from the get-go, Saddam was surprised by the Iranian response. Considering the political turbulence the country had experienced in the previous few years, he had almost assumed Iran would wither from the pressure of an external attack and internal upheaval from ordinary Iranians. Instead, what he found was a disjointed nation that was galvanized by a foreign aggressor. Domestically, Ayatollah Khomeini was facing serious threats from all directions. The MEK were launching attacks on high-ranking members of the regime. Even amongst the ulama, there was dissension with Khomeini's strict vision. Segments of Iranian society itself was becoming alienated with the Islamic Republic as it slowly realized it had replaced one dictator in the Shah with another in Khomeini. But rather than capitulating, Ayatollah Khomeini saw an opportunity to secure his Islamic revolution. The military investments made by the Shah in the previous few decades meant that the country still retained fairly sophisticated weaponry. The Iranian response was decisive. In fact, just 2 hours after the initial Iraqi airstrike, Iranian fighter jets responded with their own attack. 2 months later, in November, Operation Morvarid prevented Iraqi dominance over the Persian Gulf and destroyed much of the Iraqi navy. This meant Iraq could not entirely blockade the port of Abadan, allowing Iran to resupply it by sea and thereby directly contributing to the siege's eventual failure. From early 1981 onwards, Iraqi offensives essentially stalled. In January of that year, it was Iran's turn to go on the offensive, launching Operation Nasr. The brainchild of President Bani Sadr, it was intended to drive the Iraqis out of Khuzestan. But internal turmoil within the new Iranian government meant that the operation would end up becoming a disastrous failure. Upon ascending to power, Khomeini had purged the military of officers whose loyalties he doubted. Countless senior officers were imprisoned, executed, or fled abroad. At the same time, he had established the Sepah-e Pastaran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to ensure the protection of the Islamic Republic. This resulted in a rivalry between the army and the IRGC. To further confound matters, this rivalry took shape politically as the moderate President Bani Sadr supported the army, whilst more hardliner members of the government supported the Revolutionary Guards. So when Operation Nasr failed, it set off a chain of events within Iran. Bani Sadr's opponents were emboldened, soon after impeaching him in June 1981. Knowing firsthand what happened to those who fell afoul of the regime, Bani Sadr decided to flee the country. From this point on, Iran's government was unified under Islamist hardliners who would intensify their grip on power over the next few years by eliminating all rivals. From 1980 to 1983, the regime launched the Cultural Revolution, seeking to root out nonconformist thought amongst institutions of higher education. Universities were shut down for this period, students and teachers were purged. Dissident groups like the MEK would fight back by unleashing a wave of high-profile attacks on prominent figures of the regime. An attack on the Prime Minister's office in August 1981 left both the new President Reza I and Prime Minister Bahunar dead. Even the current Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was the target of an assassination attempt a few months earlier in June 1981. The MEK would go on to collaborate with Saddam from 1983 onwards. This revolutionary crisis mode would come to pass by 1983, and it was to benefit Iran's war effort against Iraq. The rivalry between the army and the IRGC would also dissipate, thereby making coordinated attacks between the two branches of the military smoother. Already by May 1982, Saddam's forces had been driven out of Iranian land. Saddam did not have a military background. Regardless, he decided to play soldier and micromanage the war effort. Virtually all decisions had to be funneled through Saddam, resulting in a paralyzing bottleneck. Iraqi soldiers died by the tens of thousands because of their strategically inept commander-in-chief. Due to the culture of fear he had created, nobody dared question his decision-making. To counter the bad news from the front, Saddam sought to insulate the Iraqi civilian population from the uglier realities of war. Using the oil wealth he had accumulated, the dictator spent billions of dollars importing commodities to avoid shortages. Creating a false sense of normalcy and prosperity, it was all part of a larger pattern by Saddam to build an inescapable cult of personality. Iraqi citizens lived in a world where Saddam's image was as constant as the sun in the sky. At this point, Saddam's strategy changed from holding territory within Iran to not losing any within Iraq. Immediately, he tried to sue for peace. But Khomeini was uninterested, seeing the benefits the war had brought for his regime. The Iranians did, however, have a major problem on their hands. Ever since the hostage crisis of 1979, they had been facing severe international sanctions from the US and its allies. This meant replacing weapon parts was extremely difficult, an issue they sought to fix by cannibalizing parts from other machinery and turning to the black market. To highlight the complexity of geopolitics, Israel became one of the biggest suppliers of arms to Iran during the war. The Israelis first got permission from the Americans for these arms sales, which totaled to tens of billions of dollars. When Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin launched an attack on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981, it was done with Iranian intelligence. So even though publicly the Ayatollahs maintained an antagonistic stance towards Israel, and despite America publicly supporting the sanctions on Iran, through backdoor means they did the opposite. The US also secretly sold arms to Iran. In 1986, the Iran-Contra affair came to light and shocked the world. Under the Reagan administration, America had been selling weapons to Iran and using the funds to finance the Nicaraguan Contras, right-wing rebels fighting against the Marxist Sandinista government. This was all the more embarrassing because of Operation Staunch in 1983, where the US tried to diplomatically pressure other countries not to sell Iran arms. Besides these clandestine transactions, Iran mainly relied on China, Libya, and Syria for support in arms and logistical equipment. Iraq, on the other hand, received much more international support. Around the time that the war moved from Iranian to Iraqi soil, the oil-rich Gulf countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia started providing Saddam with massive loans, fearing Tehran's warlike and revolutionary regime would harm their own interests. Syria was one of the only Arab countries to stand behind Iran, shutting down the Kirkuk-Banias pipeline from 1982 onwards, resulting in a catastrophic loss of capital for Saddam, losing billions of dollars every month. But support from the Gulf countries prevented Iraq from bankruptcy, with some estimating Saudi loans alone to be $1 billion per month. In addition, Saddam also received a lot of support from the USSR and Western countries such as France and West Germany. In 1982, America normalized relations with Iraq and went on to provide the Iraqi dictator with military intelligence as well as selling arms to him. It was crucial for US interests in the Middle East for Iraq to not lose the war, because it would destabilize neighboring countries which had pro-American governments. Not to mention the massive impact an Iranian victory would have on the oil industry. Iran's invasion of Iraq convinced Saddam that he had to pursue a policy of total war, gearing the entire society for Iraq's defense. So he drafted even more soldiers into both the regular Iraqi army and the Iraqi Popular Army, a paramilitary force consisting of civilian volunteers. At the start of the war, Iran held a clear manpower advantage, but by 1984, the forces were equal in numbers. Just 2 years later, Iraq's forces were significantly higher than their foe, and by the end of the war in 1988, Iraq's army numbered 1 million soldiers, perhaps more, whilst Iran had almost half that number. Saddam used this numerical advantage by employing a defense-in-depth strategy, creating multiple lines of defense that intended to bleed the Iranians through attrition. This was especially effective against the Iranian strategy of human wave attacks, whereby their infantry would try to overwhelm Iraqi defense lines with sheer numbers. Once parity in army sizes was reached, these attacks were favored less by the Iranian high command anyway. The Iranian objective was to break the Iraqi resolve to fight, but buoyed by funding and weapons from the West and the Gulf monarchies, Iraq remained resolute. Even when the Iranians teamed up with the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurdish resistance movement, to open up a new front in the north, the deadlock could not be broken. From 1982 until 1988, the conflict consisted of constant Iranian offensives that were rebuffed by a determined Iraqi defense. Unconventional warfare became normalized as the two sides settled into a World War I-like trench warfare. Both sides began targeting civilians, with their air forces attacking major cities from the opposing side in order to terrorize the civilian population. From 1984 onwards, the two countries began targeting each other's ability to export oil in the Persian Gulf, as the global financial system watched nervously. By 1987, American warships intervened by escorting Kuwaiti tankers which were being attacked by the Iranians. Saddam also gave the green light for the use of chemical weapons, with his close relationship to the USA emboldening him to do so without fear of consequences. The most deadly usage of these came just before the war ended, when Saddam decided to address the Kurds living in the north. Accusing them of being a fifth column for collaborating with Iran, he unleashed a brutal campaign against them in 1987. The height of this operation was in March 1988 in the town of Halabja, where Iraqi planes dropped chemical munitions on defenseless inhabitants who could not outrun the roiling clouds of gas. In a single day, 5,000 men, women and children were killed, 10,000 more were injured. Whilst it did earn him the ire of the international community, the Kurds were pacified for the time being. Saddam could now turn his attention back to the Iranian front. By 1988, Iran was exhausted, unable to keep up with Iraq and its powerful allies. By July of that year, Saddam's forces had reversed the small Iranian gains within the country. The key southern port city of Basra, which had been besieged multiple times, was now out of danger. Later that month, Khomeini begrudgingly accepted a ceasefire, and by August 1988, the war was over. Up to 1 million Iraqis and Iranians were dead, 700,000 were injured. Neither side gained any territory or anything else for that matter, but both sides lost a great deal. For Iran, whilst the war solidified the Ayatollah's grip on power, they had lost human capital as well as a tremendous amount of money, which was compounded by the heavy sanctions already placed on them from the international community. For Iraq, it had entered the war as a rapidly modernizing country that was the envy of most of its neighbors, but now found itself as yet another war-torn third world country. Cost estimates for rebuilding the country's infrastructure hovered at over $200 billion, a staggering amount that Iraq's annual oil revenues of $13 billion could never hope to alleviate. To make matters worse, the loans given to Iraq by its rich Gulf neighbors were going to be recalled, meaning that it was now going to face bankruptcy. By 1990, Iraq's financial difficulties in the wake of the Iran-Iraq War had not improved. As foreign debts to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait loomed, the Iraqi people were getting impatient with their leaders' broken promises and empty propaganda. New plots against the dictator's life were being uncovered at an alarming rate. Saddam's only hope of slipping the economic noose was to convince the Gulf sheikhs to forgive the debt. In his view, Iraq had acted as their shield against the Ayatollah's revolution. While Iraqis suffered and died, the sheikhs lounged in relative safety. After 8 years of crippling war, letting him off the hook was the least they could do. But they were unmoved by Saddam's pleas. The Gulf states refused to forgive the debt. Being spurned by the sheikhs flared Saddam's violent temper, and his anger quickly settled on one country in particular, Kuwait. The small Gulf country was no stranger to Iraqi claims over its territory. Towards the end of the 19th century, influence over Kuwait was contested by the Ottomans and the British. The latter won out, controlling the foreign policy for the ruling Sabah family. Prior to this, Kuwait had fallen under the nominal authority of the Ottoman Vilayat of Basra in modern-day southern Iraq. As Iraq itself became a state in the aftermath of World War I and the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire, it tried to assert its irredentist claims over its small neighbour numerous times, especially after oil was discovered in the 1930s. As recently as 1961, a few weeks after its full independence from Britain, Kuwait was threatened with invasion by the then Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. The anticipated invasion was only averted after the British sent their own forces in. But this did not put an end to Iraqi irredentism. For many in the country, Iraq contained 18 provinces. Kuwait was the long absent 19th. So in the early months of 1990, when the Kuwaiti Emir refused to forgive Iraq's debts, it was like salt in the wound. Adding to the consternation was the fact that Kuwait had been exceeding oil production limits set by OPEC, which drove the price per barrel down considerably. For a country like Iraq, whose economy was entirely dependent on oil revenues, the price drop made economic recovery almost impossible. Saddam threatened the Kuwaitis, saying that they were conducting economic warfare against him. The Kuwaitis responded obstinately, saying they would not cave to extortion. Tensions continued to escalate when Saddam deployed 30,000 troops to the Kuwaiti border on July 21st. It was an alarming show of force, but most in the international community assumed the dictator was bluffing in an attempt to bully the Kuwaitis into acquiescence. Saddam, however, was not bluffing. On August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait. Eight years of war against Iran had hardened the Iraqi military into a formidable force. With over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and a wide array of artillery and aircraft at his disposal, Saddam Hussein commanded the fourth largest army in the world. Kuwait never stood a chance. In less than 24 hours, the Kuwaiti army, a token force of 14,000 men, had completely collapsed. The Kuwaiti Emir and his family fled for their lives to neighboring Saudi Arabia in a convoy of Mercedes-Benz limousines. In one swift stroke, Saddam had returned the branch to the root, annexing the 19th province and gaining direct control of over 20% of the world's oil supplies. From his palace in Baghdad, the dictator was jubilant, but his invasion of Kuwait would not go unanswered. The international community was outraged. Within a matter of hours, the United Nations had passed a resolution calling for the unconditional withdrawal of Saddam's army from Kuwait. An embargo against Iraqi oil was implemented, economic sanctions were imposed, and Kuwait's financial assets were frozen to deny Iraq their use. It was an extreme reaction, one Saddam thought he had guarded himself against. A week before the invasion, he'd met with the US ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, to gauge what America's response would be to a potential attack on Kuwait. Glaspie had told Saddam that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, which he interpreted as a subtle nudge that an invasion would not result in any serious response. When he left the meeting with Glaspie, Saddam believed that he had received the green light. After all, Iraq had enjoyed the patronage and partnership of the Americans for years. Surely they would not rally in defense of a tiny, insignificant nation like Kuwait. He was wrong. George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States, vowed to evict the Iraqi army from Kuwait, one way or another. In invading Kuwait, Saddam had crossed a line with the Americans. They were willing to arm him, pay him, and use him as a regional pawn, but they were not willing to tolerate a new status quo where he controlled 1/5 of the world's oil supplies. Bush quickly dispatched his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to broker a deal with the Saudis to allow the deployment of United States troops to the kingdom. Fearing that the Iraqi army might cross the border in an attempt to capture Saudi oil fields as well, King Fahd agreed to open his airports to US troops. Within a matter of days, American soldiers were walking off planes in Riyadh, the first stage of a massive defense mobilization that came to be known as Operation Desert Shield. Back in Washington, D.C., the crisis in Kuwait had taken on a distinctly moral dimension for President George H.W. Bush. He came to believe that Iraq's annexation of Kuwait was akin to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor or Germany's invasion of Poland, a treacherous breach of international law by a bloodthirsty dictator. Bush was soon directly comparing Saddam to the German leader in World War II, believing that appeasing such a tyrant would set a frightening precedent and embolden other autocrats around the world. To oppose Saddam, Bush began assembling a massive international coalition. Stalwart allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan joined eagerly, and after some strategically deployed bribes, Arab nations like Egypt and Syria joined the club. Even the Soviet Union and China agreed to stand aside, refusing to support Saddam in his quixotic misadventure. In the end, around 40 nations signed on to Bush's coalition. Saddam Hussein quickly realized the gravity of his miscalculation. He had made an enemy of the world's last remaining superpower, joined by virtually the entire international community. In essence, it was Iraq against the world. Saddam, however, was defiant. To gain leverage over the coalition, he kept thousands of foreign workers in Kuwait as hostages, using them as human shields to deter any potential attack. It was a cruel, impulsive stunt, and all it succeeded in doing was deepening the world's contempt for him. In December of 1990, all of the hostages had been returned home. By the end of the year, it was clear that nothing short of direct military action would pry Kuwait out of Saddam's grip. The United Nations passed Resolution 678, which authorized the use of all necessary means to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. The resolution gave Saddam Hussein a final deadline of January 15, 1991 to pull his troops out. If he refused, the coalition would attack. The deadline came and went, and on January 17, 1991, the coalition launched a massive assault on Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm, as it came to be known, began with a blistering air offensive on Baghdad itself. Hundreds of planes dropped thousands of bombs onto the capital, and as the city went dim, block by block, Iraqi citizens braced themselves for the days ahead. For 6 weeks, the coalition's air forces rained death on Saddam's army and Iraq's cities. Using cutting-edge hardware like smart bombs and laser-guided missiles, American planes pummeled the country night after night. In the Western media, the accuracy of these weapons was lavishly overhyped, portrayed as surgical and bloodless, but the cold truth was that they often resulted in civilian casualties. It seemed as if Saddam's main offensive strategy was to target the oil fields of Kuwait. Iraqi soldiers set over 600 oil wells and lakes on fire as they retreated from the advance of the US-led forces. But this scorched earth policy was not very effective in slowing the coalition forces down. Meanwhile, American jets devastated Iraq's infrastructure. Water treatment plants, electrical grids, sewage systems, bridges, and other vital public works were left in ruins, imposing immense physical hardships on the Iraqi civilian population. On February 24th, satisfied that Iraq had been sufficiently weakened by the air campaign, the coalition moved its ground forces into Iraq and Kuwait. The Iraqi army, deflated and demoralized by weeks of air raids and bombing runs, simply melted away. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendered to the advancing coalition forces, dispelling American fears of high casualties and Vietnam-style attrition. The rout reached its bloody apex at a 6-lane highway north of Kuwait City. hundreds of Iraqi soldiers, fleeing north in stolen civilian vehicles and military transports, were trapped in a bottleneck by coalition jets and massacred. The Highway of Death, as it came to be known, was seen as an excessive case of butchery by the world's press, and under pressure from within and without, the Bush administration made the decision to end the ground war exactly 100 hours after it had begun. On March 3, 1991, a ceasefire was declared. All told, the Gulf War was a colossal defeat for Saddam, forever marring his image on the world stage. But it was not the end, and he was more determined than ever to survive what happened next. Whilst the Gulf War undoubtedly weakened Saddam, the popular rebellion that followed almost toppled him completely. Within days of the ceasefire, revolts were springing up across Iraq. Groups who had languished under Saddam's thumb for decades sensed that this was their moment to rise up and destroy the regime, whilst it was still weak from fighting Bush's coalition. In the south, Shia militias joined with army deserters in a large-scale uprising, scattering Ba'athist forces in cities like Karbala and Najaf. In the north, the long-oppressed Kurds launched a campaign to free their cities and towns from Saddam's clutches. For the Kurds, memories of horrific chemical weapon attacks in the late 80s were still fresh, but this time they believed they had something that would tip the scales: the support of the United States. During the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush repeatedly urged the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow their dictator, creating an impression that any popular uprising would have American support. But with Kuwait liberated and their UN mandate fulfilled, the Americans wanted to avoid becoming entangled in an Iraqi civil war. The elite core of Saddam's army, the Republican Guard, regrouped and launched a counterattack against the Shia militias in the south. Although the coalition ceasefire imposed a no-fly zone over Iraq for fixed-wing aircraft, the agreement included an exception for helicopters. The Iraqi army exploited this oversight to devastating effect. Attack helicopters shredded the poorly equipped rebels, while tanks reduced buildings in Karbala and Najaf to rubble. In a matter of weeks, Saddam's troops had re-established control over the region. With the Shias broken, Saddam was free to turn his guns to the Kurds in the north. Faced with the full might of the Republican Guard, the Kurdish revolt collapsed. By early April, almost 2 million refugees were crashing like waves against the Syrian and Iranian borders. Ultimately, the 1991 uprisings failed, and Saddam Hussein had proven that on his home turf, no challenger could overcome his will to remain in power. The coalition forces remained on the sidelines during the Kurdish and Shia revolts, but Saddam soon found himself facing a very different kind of invasion. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, the UN passed Resolution 687, which required Iraq to unconditionally disarm and destroy all of its non-conventional weaponry and development facilities. To enforce this mandate, the United Nations sent a series of inspection teams into Iraq who scoured the country for chemical weapons. The Iraqi government's cooperation was made a prerequisite for the lifting of the crippling economic sanctions and removal of the oil embargo. Since the invasion of Kuwait, Iraq had been unable to sell its oil or even import basic agricultural supplies like fertilizer or pesticide. Disease and malnutrition were becoming rampant. Infant mortality was at its highest level in decades. Contrary to his nation's desire, Saddam stood defiantly against the UN. To him, the West sought to humiliate him, so he instructed his ministers to obstruct and deceive the UN weapons inspectors at every turn. For the next 6 years, the inspectors were led on one wild goose chase after another. For the Iraqi people, however, the suffering continued as a result of the economic sanctions. The UN did eventually introduce the Oil for Food program where Iraq was able to sell its oil in return for food and medicine. But this was not enough, and the country remained impoverished. Memories of a prosperous and thriving Iraq in the late 1970s seemed like a half-remembered dream, and most Iraqi children born in the 1990s entered a world of poverty, disease, and unimaginable privation. Saddam and his immediate family, on the other hand, managed to get even richer than before. Uday, in particular, was guilty of breathtaking displays of political corruption. The UN arranged for periodic sales of Iraqi oil so that the country could purchase essential supplies like medicine and food. Instead, the money was routinely diverted straight into the bank accounts of Iraq's ruling elite. At the turn of the millennium, Saddam stood defiantly against the international community. But then 9/11 took place and everything changed. The American public was furious and wanted revenge. And so began the War on Terror, which saw the USA invade Afghanistan in 2001. Saddam had very little connections with Islamic fundamentalists, but American foreign policy was blinded by rage. President George Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, who fought Saddam in the Gulf War, clumsily accused Saddam of a litany of crimes, including ties to militant Islamist organizations, as well as having weapons of mass destruction. Saddam had neither. But that did not matter. Due diligence was an afterthought for the Americans in the War on Terror. Revenge was priority number one.
And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
And so in March 2003, the US and its allied coalition invaded Iraq. Across a career that spanned almost 50 years, Saddam had skillfully survived political intrigues. This time, however, the writing was on the wall for him. Within 6 weeks, the Americans had triumphed as the Ba'ath Party was dismantled. Saddam went into hiding, hounded by the US military, which was on the hunt for top Ba'athist officials. In July, Uday and Qusay were gunned down. And after 10 months, the Americans discovered the fallen tyrant in December 2003 outside of Tikrit, hiding in a hole in the ground. He was made to stand on trial for crimes against humanity in front of an Iraqi court of law. Over the next 3 years, Saddam defiantly defended his actions as witnesses were brought out to recount the various crimes committed by him. In the end, he was unsurprisingly found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. And so Saddam's story ended on December 30th, 2006, on the day of Eid al-Adha. Today, Saddam's legacy has made somewhat of a resurgence. Many Arabs around the world hold him in high esteem, seeing the dictator as a strong leader who was capable of maintaining security and stability in his country. To be fair, if you look at the state of Iraq since he's been toppled, it's not hard to see why people think that. The country has been stuck in a cycle of violence and poor governance since 2003. Sectarian and ethnic tensions seem poised to slip Iraq into a civil war. The country's internal weakness leaves it vulnerable to interference from neighboring states like Iran. But Iraq's current state should not blind us from objective history. It is true, Saddam brought a degree of stability and even prosperity, with his remarkable achievements in the 1970s being a testament of that. But he also brought economic ruin to the country, arguably leaving it in worse shape than he found it in. Whilst the UN definitely deserves blame for maintaining the cruel sanctions, Saddam is equally, if not more, complicit in impoverishing millions of Iraqis. And for what reason? Your nation is descending into a hopeless pit of despair and destitution. But avoiding the humiliation of his government was more important to Saddam. Herein lies his biggest flaw. Saddam prioritized his own self-interests over that of Iraq. Yes, he was a strongman ruler who stabilized the country, but this stability was exploited to enforce his will over the Iraqi people. And as he consistently showed throughout his reign, his will was not directed by doing what was best for his people. Which is the job of a leader, to make decisions with the intention and hopefully end result of achieving what is best for your people. It's that simple. These three leaders dominated the modern history of three of the most important Middle Eastern states. There are clear similarities between all of them. All three used force and suppression to silence dissent, earning them the label dictator. Connected to this was their uncompromising belief that their vision was the necessary one. It's also true that the three respective nations are still dealing with the consequences of their rule. They were products of their time, reacting to the circumstances they found themselves in. In the case of Ataturk and Mohammad Reza Shah, they laid infrastructural foundations which their successors benefited from to the present day, even if they were ideologically antagonistic to them. All three of them were pivotal in the shaping of the Middle East as it asserted its independence from foreign powers.
Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace!